I'm Sam Chapman. I was born and brought up in Waldoboro. I went to the high school there, and from high school I went to the University of Maine. While at the University of Maine, I became a part of the development of the Irish Sea Darling Center down in Walpole. And when I graduated from college, I went in the military for a number of years. And when I came back, I worked for the Darling Center for full time. And while there, I became involved in the aquaculture development. And from that, we developed some techniques and grew a bunch of different things, which was the beginning, the real beginning of the Downeast Institute. As odd as it seems, Maine Yankee nuclear plant down in Wiscasset was the beginning of DEI. How does that take place? Well, when it was opened up, there was research that they had to do to prove that the larvae of different bivalves didn't die from the warm water that was coming out. So one of the things that they wanted was soft-shell clams, okay, our clams. So their technician thought that he could just take the clams and get the eggs out of them, but it didn't work. So I was asked to do that for him. So I went out and I brought in maybe 24 clams, and I had no trouble. They spawned beautifully. And he got what he wanted, and I looked at all this, there was millions of eggs there. And I said, I'm not gonna throw these away. I've never raised them before, it might be fun, you know? So I put them in a tank, and my boss walked over and he says, you might as well take a 2-week vacation to try to raise those, because we all know it can't be done. There's no way. I wasn't going to try my best to do that after that. They were like any other bivalve. Once they were in the tanks, they grew and they set, and we had all kinds of soft-shell clams. We kept those clams, and the next spring, a new graduate student was working on a master's, was going to use these clams for her project, her research. So they went from Walpole to Jonesboro, and by 1980, the Extension Service approached me and asked if we could develop a 4-H project. And one of the individuals, who was John Cox from Jonesboro, said, we want to do this to give these kids an opportunity to learn about clams and everything they can, because eventually they're going to be the ones that run the town, and they need to know about clams. I said yes, a big mistake. I said yes, we can do that. So I begged, borrowed, and scrounged equipment from the Darling Center and brought it down, and we set up the Jonesboro 4-H clam project, basement of the old school. We had a retired school teacher that was raising the food, and we had all these tanks, and it took the kids a while to get used to it. They were looking to graze 20,000, but we wound up with 250,000. So at the end of the summer, what we're going to do with them, I took them back to the Irish Sea Darling Center over the winter. The next spring, there was like a quart that went down, and next spring there was 11 quarts. They grew over the winter in the lab, and they did very well. So the extension agent wanted me to come down and spend the summer down there. I says, Durwood, I can't do that. I got a job and I got to run the lab in the summertime. You got to get somebody else. So this is where this fellow that had just got his master's down in North Carolina, and he did it with clams, was hired. And this was Brian Beal then, who turned eventually into Dr. Beal.
So that whole summer of '83, I'm in a camp in Jonesport hearing about this project, and then the fall comes and the winter comes, and I learn, these people at the Cooperative Extension want to take these clams that these kids have raised and move them to the clam flats. And Sam Chapman can't do that, and we're looking for basically a marine ecologist. And so this position was created with me in mind, and I got hired in February of '84. And then, April, May, June, I've been working with Sam and working with the kids and respawning clams, and that's the first time that I'd ever learned how to spawn a clam. And so, it was just like, this is manna from heaven. I'm on the mud flats, or I'm working with kids doing mud flat stuff basically 24/7. So that was very happy. But that ended. That 1984 ended, and I then took a permanent job, or a more permanent job, with the University of Maine at Machias. In the mid-1980s, we could see that the landings of clams were just plummeting from where they had been in the 1970s.
At that time, there was a very large harvesting, numbers of people harvesting in the state. And over time, the green crabs have increased and increased and increased. And now there's several thousand people not in the industry anymore. You go out on the seashore at night, anywhere, and the tide is down, and you take a flashlight and shine it at the edge, and you're looking down there, and it's like a horror show. It's just crabs and crabs and crabs. They made fences. They made to try to keep them out. Nothing really worked.
I ended up working as an environmental education project coordinator for the University of Maine at Machias in '85. And this person in the Maine Sea Grant office in Orono, David Dow, contacted me in the spring of 1986. And he said, "Have I ever heard of this outfit in Oregon called the National Coastal Resources Research Institute?" No, I hadn't. He said, "Well, take a look at it." And he said, I know that you're a couple of years away from working with the 4-H project in Jonesboro and working with Sam, but think about, adults and clam spawning and using those clams to generate, new opportunities for clammers on flats. I mean, it wasn't my idea, it was Dave Dow's. So I read this about the National Coastal Resources Research Institute, and I thought, Dave Dow's got a great idea. We've got the technology to do it. I mean, the way in which I spun it was, if we can do it with kids, why can't we do it with adults? And so, I drove over and talked to Albert and Richard Carver about, maybe using the old clam shop at Perio Point to renovate into a hatchery if we got this grant. And they said, gee, that sounds like a great idea. And since they're in the clamming business, and this, was supposed to raise clams, put on flats, and clammers sell them, so they thought, sounds like a great idea. And what an interesting thing to turn the old clam shucking shop into a shellfish hatchery.
My name is Jane Hintson, and I live in Machias. I moved here in 1982 and went to work at the University of Maine at Machias. And I'm now retired, but I was director of special programs. At the time when I had the job at UMM, it was community-oriented outreach, adult education. And my whole job was to take UMM off the hill and take it out to all of Washington County. I graduated from Colby in 1953 with honors in biology, and my life took another turn, and I never got the chance to be the research person that I wanted to be. So when I got to meet Dr. Beal, who was in the same office building as I was in, and learned about clam culture and the research and all of it, I fell in love right there.
So I sat down and penned out a draft of a proposal, the first one I'd ever done.
Because I had this whole background in communications before I came to UMM, I think he asked me to read what he had written, which I did.
I handed her this draft, and 2 days later I get back this tome from her that's, just scribbled on, and almost every sentence restructured. And
then I spent some time explaining to him there was a difference between writing a science report and writing a proposal for money.
You know, a paragraph in the middle of it put on the end and one in the end moved to the beginning, and it was a work of art.
Maybe I'm his alter ego, he doesn't know it.
And so we had 6 communities that are in the Jonesport and Beals area, from Addison and Jonesport and Beals, Rokes Bluff, Jonesboro, and Machias Port. Those were our 6 communities going in, and I knew nothing about writing grants, but I did know that this NCRI, National Coastal Resources Institute, was interested in match monies. So I went to them and I said, gee, we need some match. Would you be willing to have the town appropriate $500 so that we could put in $3,000 as an in-kind cash match that would go along with this building that the carvers could? And, you know, it was kind of like everyone said yes. You know, there wasn't any, no, we don't want to do this. It had, I think, benefited, obviously, from that 4-H program several years before and all the publicity that had generated, and it was in people's minds. So it was an easy thing to kind of put together. And I submitted it, you know, with Jane's blessing, and 6 months later, I'm, you know, running down the halls at UMM, my first grant, you know, they'd funded it. I'm so happy. It was like $40,000, and we were going to be able to renovate it. And probably for the next 6 or 7 years, everything, didn't make any difference where it went. Everything I wrote went through Jane. We started in '87 by cleaning up the old clam shop and reconverting it into a hatchery. We were successful that first year and found that the limiting factor was the food. We couldn't raise enough algae in the small converted greenhouse that we had built on the southern side of that clam shucking house. And so we found another outlet for grant funding through the Maine Science and Technology Board. We wrote a grant to put up a 50-foot by 20-foot wide by 14-foot tall greenhouse adjacent to the clam shucking house. And that's what we did in 1988, the year after we opened the doors to the hatchery. And we were able to buy dozens more of the algal tubes that we have next door. And we were able to buy some really large 3,000-gallon tanks to raise more clams in. We also invited 4 more communities to participate: Cutler, Steuben, the Mount Desert Island Regional Hatchery, and I think Gouldsboro. And unfortunately, we didn't raise many clams that year because that was the first year that we had run into a problem with bacteria.
What was happening was, okay, first of all, outside on either side of the hatchery was lobster pounds, and the lobster pounds had these big sheds with all kinds of fish in them, okay? And the flies, of course, the flies in the summertime are being attracted to the fish. And then they take up and they fly around. They were coming in and getting into the tanks that we raised the food for the clams in.
And so it was really kind of a pinch and a reality check that this thing isn't as easy as we thought it was. Because the first year it was fairly smooth. And the second year, we couldn't even manage to raise 100,000 soft-shell clam, whereas the year before we raised almost 6 million. It was during 1988 that we decided that we didn't know a lot about what we ought to be doing with these clams once we put them out on the flats. And we went back to Sea Grant for a 2-year project that would answer some questions like, when is the best time of year to be seeding these flats? And where should you be planting the clams? What kind of predator protection do we need? And so we had all these really very applied sorts of questions and went to Sea Grant with a proposal. And that was the first research grant that I had written with Jane's help as well. So that was a very eye-opening one. Not only did we learn what time of year to plant, but we also learned when clams grow. We also learned about predation and using netting to keep predators at bay. and that it's not 100% effective in what we could expect. Of course, we had tried to include school groups. We built a small education center on the end of our greenhouse called the Dana Wallace Education Center. And, you know, it was great being able to work with kids from Harrington or work from kids from Beals Island and Jonesport. We did projects out on clam flats with them. It was really fun.
It had operated under the University of Maine at Machias, and then the powers that be decided that they wanted to cut us loose.
The president of the university walks into my office at UMM and says, literally, we're out of the shellfish hatchery business, and I'll give you about a year, but after that, we're done. Well, you know, I immediately went up and cried on Jane's shoulder, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? So, you know, between me and Jane and Dianne Tilton, we decided that maybe there might be some rescue in the larger community.
I'm trying to remember or imagine why DEI and originally Beals Island Shellfish Hatchery held the attraction for me that it always has. I worked in advertising originally, and then moved back to Maine and raised my family and ran an economic development organization that had an interest, a particular interest in realizing as many opportunities as possible from our natural resource industries, because the board of that organization, the Sunrise County Economic Council, reasoned that that was something that couldn't be taken away from us. It's not like having a mill that can be anywhere and it shuts down and goes away. You're always gonna, if you take care of your natural resources, you're always gonna have them. And so what the Beals Island Shellfish Hatchery was doing at the time was exactly what our organization was wanting to see. They were working to preserve and sustain a fishery for the people to be able to continue to fish and make a living. And the clams, that the soft-shell clams and lobsters and everything else that is sold outside the state, that creates wealth in the state of Maine, because it's an import industry and it brings money into the state. And so we were all about what the Beals Island Shellfish Hatchery was doing. And that was, I think, why Brian had asked me to help him think about how the Birch could spin off successfully from UMM.
And we got hooked up with Alla Reed from Kennebunkport, and she was amazing to work with. She actually was working with other nonprofits around the state, helping them organize, and through her work, as well as grabbing everyone from Lynn and Wendy and Dianne and Jane and Dana Wallace, the person who we named our education center after, and of course Sam. We just got together and started thinking about how this would work. Sea Grant was involved, the University of Maine at Machias was involved, the University of Maine was involved, Maine Aquaculture Innovation Center, Sunrise County Economic Council, just a whole bunch of different folks that, they looked at what we had been doing for 7 years and said, we got to keep this thing rolling. And that was a really, it was a stressful time, that transition, very anxious moments, but together everyone did it.
And then we changed the name from the rather provincial Beals Island Regional Shellfish Hatchery to the Downeast Institute for Applied Marine Research and Education, which I pointed out is quite long to put on letterhead. So it has become shortened now to Downeast Institute, which is much more manageable.
We had a board retreat in late 1998 that continued or spilled over into 1999, and Ron Beard was the facilitator. And if there's anybody in the state of Maine that's been to a meeting that Ron Beard has facilitated, all they're going to do is just bow down and say, this guy is the ultimate in facilitating whatever, whatever. He studies it, He knows what he's going to ask. He knows, how to get people, interacting with each other. And in this particular instance, he was facilitating a meeting that had us look forward. And one of the things was, a facility that would be attractive to marine scientists that want to come to the area. Why couldn't we create some kind of field station for the University of Maine at Machias? Running seawater facility that if someone wanted to come and hold animals prior to putting them out in an experiment, that there'd be enough room. An expanded shellfish hatchery, an education center and classroom. And so all these things got discussed, and it created a kernel, a seed. And it was one of those things that I couldn't put down.
But Brian won a scholarship to go to Ireland in the year 2000. And because I was chairman of the board, I sort of took over Brian's responsibilities. We were still operating off this long 150-foot wharf in the little clam shed. And in the fall, you bring in these big trays that have overwintered the clams, and you have to take the clams out, clean the trays, put the clams back in. Well, we had to, because that building was so small, we had to drag it out onto the wharf. And because there wasn't room, the trouble was that the people who owned the wharf, who hadn't used it in years, decided that particular year that they were going to reactivate the wharf. So every time a whole line of lobstermen came down the wharf, we'd have to put all of the trays inside. And then when they went away, we dragged them all out again. So I think it was about 11 o'clock at night when we were still doing this in November, with a temperature about 10 and floodlights. And at that point, I realized we need a bigger building. And that became my mission after that.
And so we started looking around in a 25-mile radius around Machias as to where this field station, this new expanded facility, could go. We looked at places in Machias Port. We looked at a place in Jonesport. And Dianne Tilton had this place in her mind all the way out at the end of the Black Duck Cove Road.
And actually, while Brian was still in Ireland, I sent him a picture. Someone gave me a picture of that property, and I didn't really hear back from him, but I thought, well, I've planted the seed, so maybe when he comes home, he'll take a look at it.
In the summer of 2001, I went down there with Albert Carver and my father, and we went out on the end of that old dilapidated wharf, that wooden wharf that had a little kind of curl at the end of it, that ultimately we knew it was falling into the mud. And I looked around, and there's 2 lobster pounds. There's this 80-foot by 80-foot 2-story building. There's this wharf, even though it's in tough shape, it's still a wharf. And all this nice 2,000 feet of frontage. And I'm looking around and I'm thinking, my God, this is it. We spent another 2 years at Perio Point. And it took us those 2 years to figure out how we could rent this place for $1,000 a month, with the agreement with the owners of putting that money towards the purchase price, which was $1.3 million. Well, it's going to take a few months at $1,000 to get $1.3 million, but they agreed, and we got a lot of help from the Maine Science and Technology Foundation and MTI. We got a lot of help from our congressional delegation, Susan Collins and Olympia Snow. We got a lot of help from the governor at the time, John Baldacci. And together they helped us create a way forward to ultimately find the funds to pay for this phenomenal facility that we saw back in 2001. That was 2006 that we ultimately signed. The DEI board signed on the dotted line and were the owners of this property.
I I think our acquisition of our phenomenal Black Duck Cove property was a big turning point. We had outgrown our much smaller facility at Perio Point, where we of course didn't own the land, and I just think that was a really kind of remarkable that we were able to accomplish it, and it's just a phenomenal property.
We raised lobsters, we raised sea urchins, we tried scallops. We got a chance to do things with razor clams and Arctic surf clams and all that. And in the background was, well, 1999 and that retreat and trying to create what we started to call the easternmost marine research lab and education center in the US. But you're working in Washington County and the funds aren't, they're not coming out of the woodwork, and you wait and you wait and you wait. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere comes something called the Next Generation Foundation. They're looking for projects to fund in Maine that make sense financially, economically, that have some goodwill towards the communities that they're in. It ended up with a site visit in October of 2014 by three of the folks from the Next Generation Foundation. When they first came in, it was like, is this what you do? What is it? And then 2 hours later, they hadn't left, even though they were supposed to only be there for about an hour. So they were out the door, headed to Lubec for another site visit, and honestly, I didn't think any more of it until sometime in December or early January, I went from my office at UMM to my mailbox in the science building, and I pulled out this envelope. It was a 42-cent stamped envelope from the Next Generation Foundation, and it wasn't, registered mail or anything like that. It just was a letter that you'd get from Mom. And I opened it up, and it's a check that's signed for $2 million. $2 million with a little Post-it note on it that said, when you get this, would you email us to let us know that you got it safely? And I'm thinking, holy cow, this is it. This is the springboard to that kernel that we, had talked about all those years before. And over the course of the next couple of years, we were able to take that $2 million and leverage it for another $2 million. And so, the whole time between 2017 and 2018, it was like just chaos.
I really think that as a board, we collectively, and some of us individually, sighed a big sigh of relief when we were finally able to hire a full-time executive director, as well as a director of education. And of course, without the passion and dedication and unwavering work ethic of Dr. Brian Beal, none of this would have continued.
Right. Remember, I mentioned that John Cox from Jonesboro wanted the kids to understand the biology of clams, so when they get to be the town fathers, they know what they're talking about. So here we are at DEI now, at a much higher level, many more kids involved in this whole thing over the course of a year, doing just what John Cox wanted to see. The educational aspect of DEI is invaluable. You just can't put a price on it.
It's kind of homegrown, I guess you'd say. And because of that, people feel a real ownership and dedication to the Institute.
I get really souped up about this stuff when I think about, what it's meant and what it's become. And you know, if you could have taken that 1999 retreat and said, you'll never get that. It's like a checklist. There's almost everything on that list we've checked, and only because of hard work and people saying it's worth it.
If I would pick one word to summarize how I feel about the successes of DEI, it would be perseverance. They've never given up.
They're genuinely rooted in the desire to serve, the desire to have a positive effect on people's lives.
So, you know, our intention has been the same since 1987 as it is today. Produce soft-shell clam seed and work with communities to enhance what clammers can make for a living. That's as simple as it is.
Our intention is to help sustain coastal communities because that's where we're from, and that's what's important to us.